welcome everybody. It's so wonderful that you have found your way into our chapel space on Wednesday morning. Thank you, Destiny. I appreciate that very much. Now, if you're familiar with this space, we usually meet and have worship music and connect with God, and we do those things. Then we have somebody come up here and maybe yell at you about the Bible, for a little while. But today, every so often, there are certain things that are happening in the world where I think it's really important that we just pause and explore and have conversation and see if there are ways that we can respond. So today, I thought, and we thought that it seemed most appropriate to respond to what's happening in Gaza right now between Israel and Palestine. So I'd like to introduce my small panel here. And then I'll try to give just a very quick overview of the current conflict and what's been happening, and then move to some Q&A, and we can also take some Q&A from the audience as well. So first we have a psychology professor here at FPU, Dr. Jay Pope. Give him a hand. And Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies, Dr. Brian Schultz. Give him a hand as well. So welcome. And again, as we move through this, a number will be up there for you to text in questions if you'd like. But so let me try to just say what's happened. If I know that some of you follow the news and maybe you have seen, but I just want to make sure to get that out there. I'm glad that Dr. Schultz just recommended that we start the conversation just by looking at a couple maps where the conflict is happening to give us a visual of the area. So I know that a lot of you probably know where Israel, Palestine is, but it helped to see some maps. So the first one there is you can just kind of see the area and the little kind of cutout with the globe and just obviously east of the Mediterranean. Israel, the West Bank, which is a Palestinian territory, and the Gaza Strip, which is also a Palestinian territory, and then kind of the surrounding area, which is Israel. Just to kind of put this in context, this is a map that's of that same area that's overlaid over the state of California. Just to give a perspective of either how big or small it is, which is really from about the Visalia area or where we are, that would go all the way down to San Diego. And there's one more, I think, if you could go to that one. This one was cut off a little bit, but basically just this is just the Gaza Strip that you saw there. Again, overlaid over the greater Los Angeles area. So we might refer back to these, and it'll give you a visual for what's happening. But just real briefly, on October 7th, an organization called Hamas, which for now I'll just say is one of the ruling groups in the Palestinian territories, launched an attack on Israel. You may have seen this or read about it in the news or on social media. So the attack on Israel that killed more than 1,400 people, and they took at least 239 hostages. And since then, Israel has carried out retaliatory strikes on Gaza, which has killed over 8,000 people. Some estimates are actually at about 8,400 people, and some humanitarian agencies are kind of estimating that half of those are children. On October 13th, the residents that were more in the northern area of the Gaza Strip, including Gaza City, received evacuation orders from Israel, which would signal more strikes and potential ground invasion from the north. And the reports out of this area now are, of course, that especially in the northern Gaza Strip is without electricity, reliable water, which is kind of controlled from the outside, and really that the infrastructure is crumbling, and it's creating quite a humanitarian crisis. And just before Destiny, you said, I don't know how you all are doing this morning. My heart is heavy. I'm really sad, and I'm trying to process through what's happening, and I hope that we can do the same this morning. But again, I checked the news just as I was going to bed last night, and there was another reported strike on basically a refugee camp in the Gaza region as well. So people are saying that this conflict will and already has, will spill over into the region and then into the world, maybe physically and violently. That's not to say, talk about the stakes that other countries have, already with these areas and states. So I'd like to, start to ask some questions now, but I think the first one that I have, and again, there should be a number that'll pop up that I should be able to check on my phone if you text in questions that you have, maybe that are just on your heart or mind and you'd like, some engagement with, you could feel free to do so. But I think I didn't just grab these guys off the street. There's some investment into the area and some expertise and knowledge. So I think my first question is, just what is your interest, I guess I would say, in this conflict? Maybe how you've responded personally to what's happening. So what's the background there for both of you? Maybe Jay, we can start with you.
Thanks, Brian. I think the best way to introduce the topic from my perspective is just to talk a little bit about my family's involvement. My grandparents, I grew up in the Presbyterian Church, and my grandparents were people who served over in the Middle East for the better part of their lives. And back in around 1950, the Presbyterian Church had a huge vision for wanting to reach every corner of the world and to be able to send people. And of course, that term missionary is a very loaded term with connotations of imperialism and cultural appropriation and aggression. But nevertheless, my grandparents were the kind of people who, in good faith, embraced this call and really wanted to move to the region and follow the will of God and try to be as much as possible a light. And their call was not to try to convert people from one religion to another, but rather to strengthen and to encourage the church that was already in the Middle East. And so their call took them to the country of Lebanon. And they served most of their lives in the Arab-speaking world. They were in Lebanon, they were in Egypt, they were in Saudi Arabia. Even in their 70s and getting into their 80s, they were in Sudan and South Sudan. And so quite a life. But I grew up in the evangelical church. I'm a child of the 1980s. And I found myself in the minority because my grandparents, I would notice a couple things they would say. And they would say, they would watch the news and they would shake their head. And I certainly was the only member of my church who probably had grandparents who seemed to take the side of the Palestinians in all of these disputes that would come up. They would shake their hand. And I find that when I became of age, I questioned my grandparents and why when you see the news, you shake your head at what Israel does? And my grandfather turned to me and said, in all of our years in serving in the Middle East, there was one constant thorn in our side toward the spread of the gospel, and that was U.S. foreign policy cooperating with Israeli foreign policy. It just thwarted the growth of the church and choked the growth of the church in the Middle East. And it was a source of lifelong frustration for them. That they didn't grow up with any feeling of anti-Semitism. It was just something they were surprised to find, that the big stumbling block for them continued to be not Jews, but Israeli foreign policy, Israeli militarism, with the sponsorship with the backing of the United States. So this is very interesting. I grew up in Sanger. I grew up in an evangelical church in Sanger. I definitely, there were no kids in my school that had this kind of perspective, and I'm pretty sure none of my friends' grandparents talked this way. So since then, that has led to many trips over to the Middle East, continuing to develop relationships with pastors and others who serve Christ over mainly in the Arab-speaking world, and also in Armenia, which is not the Arab-speaking world, but which is relatively close to the region.
Yeah, so my background or connection to this is quite different. I decided after I finished my undergrad degree in biblical studies that I wanted to get closer to the source of where the Bible came from, which was the land of Israel. And so then I flew over to Israel and spent over a decade living in Israel proper, getting 2 of my graduate degrees there. The first one at an American institution that's in Jerusalem, but then I did all of my PhD work at an Israeli university where the studies were in Hebrew and all that. And so I lived for, as I said, over a decade in Israel proper, and my connections and my lived experiences therefore connected much more with the Israeli side of things, and my friends are there. That's not to say that I didn't also have some interaction with the Palestinian side. I taught at Bethlehem Bible College, for example. I've been in the Gaza Strip myself and visited there. I go quite frequently to the West Bank as well. I'm friends with the shopkeeper in Sebastia, for example, and we have an ongoing friendship that's there as well. So but nonetheless, most of my lived experience has been in connection with the Israelis and those that live there.
Thanks for sharing. One of the things that I was sorting through just as we were preparing for this and thinking about it is where do you start, right? I don't know. So I'm going to ask a kind of a broad question, and I'm actually borrowing it from a biblical interpretation professor that I had in seminary. He would always say, what is this passage about? What's the aboutness of this, right? So what is this about? So what is this conflict about?
Whatever it is about, for many people around the world, it registers as something that is so central and so vital to them that they're willing to put almost everything on the line to advance it. It's about ultimate things for a lot of people, not just for the people who live in the region, but then also people who live around the world who have some sort of connection, whether it's familial or whether it's spiritual or religious, to the region. And of course, it gets caught up in the same kind of culture wars and political back and forth that a lot of people talk about. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is that, and we joked about this when we were at our church's we had a panel discussion not too long ago, where this is the kind of discussion where you have to be careful bringing it up when you're in a restaurant, because your server might come over and be very offended by something that you're saying, because these things seem to matter so much. If you're online, if you're on Instagram, if you're on TikTok, and you bring people offer their perspectives, they're doing a lot of this kind of gesturing to the camera. They're speaking with a great deal of passion, and so it's about faith, it's about politics, it's about land, it's about ultimate things, it's about ultimate concerns for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would maybe narrow that down. Correct. That's a great overall look, but I would narrow it down a little bit to the fact that it's an issue of who belongs in a certain plot of land, being the land of Israel or Palestine, however you want to call it. There was a people group that lived there, the Arab population that lived in this swath of land that we saw on the maps right there, and eventually another group came in and took up residence there, if we could put it that way. And the people that came in feel that now it's their right to be in that land, and the people who saw them come in are saying, well, you have no right to being here, and so that conflict over land has continued since then. The reason why it evokes such emotion is not just because it's a fight over territory, but that that land right there is connected to world faiths, specifically all three major faiths, both we have Islam that's connected to it, you've got Judaism that's connected to it, and Christianity is connected to it. And so some people see some religious reasons as to why this conflict over land is vital for the way that they perceive the world and the way they perceive their faith.
Yeah, just on that note, I didn't know you said some people were there, some people moved in, and I'm interested in a little bit more about that. I don't know. We were talking like, is this a theological conversation? Is this a geopolitical one? Is it a historical one? I know that it's all of those things. Maybe if either of you are able to get a little bit of the more specific history for how we arrived at even on the map we saw the lines, right? And those lines would even be different in other countries that recognize certain lines or certain borders, and those borders have moved over the last 50, 100 years, right? So if there's a question in there somewhere, whose land is this?
I'm not going to answer that one.
Yeah, okay.
What I will say is that I think you can play this game where you kind of go back into history indefinitely. I think a lot of us can relate probably to World War I and World War II and the aftermath, where after war, a lot of the people who win wars will kind of divide the nations up, and a lot of this, much of this is drawn up on cocktail napkins and written on trains. This without any real knowledge of local customs and local realities on the ground. And so, but after after, of course, World War II, you can go after World War I or World War II. After World War I, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that's when the British came in, and the so-called British Mandate controlled much of what we now would consider to be Palestine. The French Mandate controlled Lebanon, just to the north. And so Palestine was more or less governed by a government from the United Kingdom. Then after the end of World War II, I think probably the Holocaust is probably the single biggest spark or motivating factor that although there were conversations long before the Holocaust about wanting to have a homeland for Jewish people around the world who have historically suffered from a great deal of persecution. And so that really galvanized, resulting in, shortly after World War II, in the formation of Israel as a nation in 1948, but of course coinciding with what the Arabs call the Nakba, the catastrophe, which resulted in a lot of ethnic cleansing, of displacement of people who've been in the region for many, many years.
Is that good, Brian?
That's about as good as we can cover with the time that we have.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and this is a launching off point, right, for hopefully further discussion and inquiry. I want to ask a little bit about the current really the current war and conflict where there's bloodshed, and there's a couple questions in here already that kind of get to that. One sort of asking, sort of in response. Another one just came in. I think I can group all these together. In response to what Hamas has did, Israel responded, right? In response to that, some people will say, Israel has a right to defend itself. Others will say, this is sort of a guise for genocide or for ethnic cleansing. I don't know. How do we respond to those sort of talking points, that we see out there? The specific questions are, what do you feel like is a proportionate response to Hamas? Do we believe Israel is defending itself from future attacks? So these things are all obviously current and in response to what happened, like on October 7th with the Hamas attack. But what's sort of a response to that? How do we deal with those questions and talking points?
I'll give the perspective that I was, exposed to while I lived there. The Jewish people have not had a homeland up until the middle of the 20th century for the last several hundred years. And one of the purposes for establishing the State of Israel was to provide them a place where they could live without persecution. Needless to say, think of the Holocaust that happened, but there were other things prior to that, such as pogroms and forced conversions and a number of other things that threatened their lives. So they wanted a state where they could live without fearing persecution of any kind. And they decided to go into the land of Palestine and put themselves right in the middle of, I don't want to say they were enemies, but they became enemies with the people that were around there. And so therefore, from the founding of the State of Israel, they feel like they've been the brunt of repeated attacks from their neighbors and have needed to establish themselves in a way that they can provide defense from these kind of attacks. There are all kinds of attacks. There are both military attacks, but there are also terrorism attacks. What happened on October 7th, they would classify as yet another terror attack, but it really took a layer that was, it upped the ante tenfold, 100-fold from whatever had happened prior to that because of the number of people who were very brutally killed in that whole process right there. Just today, I read a headline that talked about how one of the Hamas people who came in found families hiding in their bomb shelter because houses in Israel have to have bomb shelters because of this ongoing conflict and knowing that there could be rockets that are launched in. And they said they managed to get a gun in and shoot into the room and could hear the kids and babies crying out. They said, I just kept shooting until I didn't hear any noise anymore. And I'm giving that one example to say this is the way that Hamas came in and attacked. And so Israel's perspective and the perspective of my friends who I've not talked to since the conflict has started over would be, this is a group of people who live on our borders, who, whenever they will have the opportunity, will want to come in and do this, and therefore we need to defend ourselves from this happening again. And what they realize is that the people who are wanting to perpetrate this live in very urban areas and mix in with a large population, some of which are supportive of what this group does, others of which do not agree with what this group does, but nonetheless they are all mixed in together. And Israeli society would say this is our dilemma. We have people who are hiding in the population who are wanting to kill us, and we want to bring justice to the actions that they did, and we cannot do it other than by going into very populated areas and trying to root them out. And we have this dilemma that either we don't defend ourselves because they're in a populated area, or we go in and we try to minimize casualties that are there. One of the things that you mentioned is dropping flyers saying, leave this area because we're coming in, and we don't want to have people injured and killed who are innocent to this conflict, and therefore we plead for you to leave. So that would be the perspective that the Israelis would give on saying this is our defense, this is the way that we're protecting our borders. They would also claim that there's no other country in the world that would allow for actions like that to take place without some kind of retaliation to try to get rid of it. They make parallels, for example, with 9/11, where you had someone that came from a very far country, came in and 2 planes into the World Trade Center, and we sent our army way out halfway across the world to try to root out. And in the same way that there were some innocents that died in that process there, they're doing the same thing. They would say the difference is wherever bin Laden was hiding was a lowly populated territory, whereas Gaza Strip is one of the most, if not the most populated places on earth, and therefore the damage that the casualties of innocent lives is much higher.
Jay, I know you're not here representing, a side or Palestine, or yeah, of course, but
my best guess would be that for every, I think a Palestinian would probably say something along the lines of, for every atrocity committed by the people who claim to represent us but don't do so adequately, militant groups such as Hamas, for every atrocity they have committed, we have been on the receiving end of that in the form of a slow choke and a slow bleed for the better part of 75 years. You look at any list of casualties, and it's always far, far more, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 30 to 1, Palestinians are being killed more than Israelis. Palestinian children are being killed far more than Israeli children. And not just in terms of reprisals, but in terms, they would see it as being first acts. Like, for example, they would say, look, for the most part, for the most of the history of Jewish people, the people that were most likely to persecute you were Christians, not Muslims. We largely lived in the Middle East relatively peacefully. We let you exist, you let us exist for many years. Why all of a sudden is it that you seem to say that Muslims and Arab-speaking people are your enemies in the region? And lots of Muslims and Arab-speaking people would say, because you made this unilateral move by declaring, planting a flag in the ground in an area that you had largely no historical claim to, and declared yourselves a nation. Who does that? Who gets to do that? I live here. They see their plight similar to the plight of the Native Americans.
Maybe if there is some of the history there even too involved with Hamas, like what is Hamas relative to the Palestinian people? How do we understand that?
When Brian and I were children, the large public figure that represented Palestinians was Yasser Arafat. And Arafat represented both the West Bank and Gaza. So if you call up that map again, maybe it would be helpful. Palestinian territories typically revolve around the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. But they often fight against each other, mainly not in terms of taking up arms against each other, but they disagree on a lot of things politically. So Hamas is a more militant body that exists only in the Gaza Strip, but not in the West Bank. So the majority of Palestinians live in the West Bank. Slightly fewer Palestinians live now in Gaza. So Hamas is more represented in Gaza, and the PA, or the Palestinian Authority, is what usually governs the area that we now call the West Bank, which is now 60% Israeli, because of settlements.
Okay.
I think we should add to it that it's an organization in its own right that doesn't need a territory and doesn't even need a people. It's just people who adhere to a certain ideology and to a certain charter that they've drawn up. And I'd encourage all of you to go and look up the charter of Hamas, just so you can be more informed about it. But it's also a political entity. It's also a charitable organization. It encompasses different aspects to it, and so it's hard to say exactly what it is. And I think it's also should be said that the United States and a number of other countries have declared it to be a terrorist organization because of some of what it stands for.
The Hamas started out as kind of kids would walk down the street and they would see these bearded guys talking about, and they used to be kind of, they were such a minority and they didn't represent the rest of the population. But when you're dealing with people who are persecuted and there's a power vacuum, sometimes the people that come up and take charge in those situations are people that kind of resemble the mafia. There's kind of this mafia mentality where they are going to do some extreme things, but they're also going to build playgrounds, and they're going to build gyms, and they're going to make sure the streets and social services are taken care of. And so people are like, well, what am I going to do now? If I want to get food, if I want to get my kids an education, if I want my kids to be able to go out and play in a park, the only people that can provide me with those kinds of assurances and defend me against my enemy are these thugs. Well, what am I going to do? So it puts them in a very difficult situation. If you ask most Palestinians, they would say, Hamas does not represent me, but they do a better job of representing me than some of the so-called legitimate people who have failed because of corruption and other things.
I'm trying to do the reporter thing where I'm engaged here, but listening to the questions coming in, which is tough to do. Actually, I didn't realize that. But
and what I just described also describes Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah,
similar
to the north, right?
Branded as a terrorist organization, but has by far more power in Lebanon than any other paramilitary group in that country.
I'll ask you. We're already butting up against time, and we have something that we want to do at the end here. So I want to ask maybe two questions. The first one, maybe just quickly, but some questions are coming in about, like, who do we side with here, right? Like, who do we side with here? And I think part of the answer to that question is that at least the United States government I feel like, has sided. Would you say the United States government has sided on one side? And what does that partnership, if you want to put it that way, actually look like?
Yeah, they've sided with Israel. Yeah, very, very clearly. And politicians have known about this for many years, that whether that is actual support of Israel or whether that is begrudging support of Israel, given our own country's history of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism in our country is on the rise. All politicians know that you have to, if you want to be elected, say uniformly positive things about Israel, whether you believe them or not. You will not get elected. That is political suicide if you criticize Israel. And so whether politicians actually believe it or not, they're going to say it. And the United States has stood by them. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is that the United States has also given many, many millions of dollars, both to Hezbollah and to Hamas over the years, for those same internal security issues. Just last year, the United States gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Hezbollah, the same people they call the terrorist organization, so they could fight in Syria. So there's a lot of the simple statements you see by politicians on television that I'm sure you know by now, don't take those at face value.
Again, getting close to the time, maybe I'll try to combine a couple questions, but this means certain things for us, just by virtue of being United States citizens, right? I mean, just for those who pay taxes, for example, we're involved in some way. I think as Christians, I think I'm just wondering through a little bit, what really does this mean for us? How do we respond meaningfully? And maybe in a way that, we say we serve a God of hope. How do we respond in ways that maybe will build hope? Is there any hope? from your perspective, and how can we respond just from our little corner of the world?
From my perspective, as far as the immediate conflict is concerned, I don't have much hope. I think this is going to be a long, drawn-out conflict, and we're going to see the death will rise on both sides. As Jay said, it's going to rise on the Palestinian Arab side way more than it's going to rise on the Israeli side. The atrocities are just going to continue on. Who do we side with? I think the simplistic answer is I think we should side with the victims of the violence, the innocent victims of the violence. So we think what happened October 7th of thousands of youths at a rave concert being gunned down. We side with the people who lost loved ones and who were abducted and taken into Gaza. They are there, they're part of a political entity that has a certain perspective, but really they're not really the active participants on it. We side with the hundreds and thousands of families in Gaza who are also not actively involved in the conflict. They're present there. They end up being the people who lose their loved ones, their entire families because of the bombing that's taking place, and we need to side with them as well. And we need to pray for them. And pray in faith that in God's miraculous way that His kingdom can come in those situations, as tragic and as horrible as they are.
Thank you, Brian. I think that I'm right there with you. And I was struck by, I feel like when I come to these, when I'm asked to serve as a panelist, when you're asked to serve as a panelist, I'm always humbled by the worship that we engage in before we begin speaking. And I took a couple of photos of the last song that we sung, and I'd not heard the song before, so I looked at the lyrics. I think we sang, "Here is where I lay it down, every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender." And I'm struck by how the heart of the Christian faith is the act of surrendering, the way of peace. One of the hardest teachings, I read The Cost of Discipleship as a freshman in college, and the opening lines of The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer read, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." And I wonder how many people, even Christians who have a vested interest in this conflict, actually have that attitude of surrendering, of choosing the way of peace. What I see much more is language of dehumanizing other people and self-aggrandizement, saying that my way is better. I hope that my side wins. I would say praying for peace, praying for mercy. I would say be very careful about praying for justice. Human justice has a funny way of conflicting with God's justice. Are you sure you want the Lord's justice? And are you prepared for the justice of the Lord if that's something that you actually pray for? How is that going to affect you personally? When we pray for the justice of the Lord, we're usually thinking about our enemies. It's like when we're kids and we say those prayers like, "God, I pray that you will help my parents realize how stupid they're being." Those kinds of prayers that we pray. Those selfish prayers where we pray that we can get what we want. When we pray for what we want and when we pray for things like justice, we're often in for a rude awakening. To me, prayer, befriending people who happen to be victims, if possible. You don't need to travel over there to find people who are Jewish here in Fresno and people who are Palestinian here in Fresno and who have deep connections, and befriend them, pray for them, serve them. They often represent many people who can't be here in the United States, and your actions in that way could go on.
I just want to add one other thing. Pray for the Christians, whether they are in Israel, the state of Israel, whether they're in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. Pray for them as well, because their situation is even more complicated than the already complicated situation of Israel versus Palestine.
Thanks for that. Was a question I potentially had too. Is just where are the Christians in this, and not just between Jewish folks and Islamic people.
The majority of Christians in the region are Palestinian.
Yeah.
And Palestinian people used to be 30% Christian, but as a result of a lot of the ethnic cleansing and the displacements, that number is now 1%.
So lots of things to engage as we go from this place. Really, we are over time, right? So if you have to make it to your next class and your grade depends on it, you can kind of filter out. But and no shame if you do that. That's fine. Jay, you just asked that we would actually play a song as we're sort of filtering out. I'd like for you to just. We're gonna play that. We're gonna say the Lord's Prayer together too. But before, what's this song and the meaning?
This song, if you've ever been to the Middle East or the Arab-speaking world, you've undoubtedly heard the music of Fairuz. Fairuz is an international icon, and she sang a song back in 1957 called El Bint Shalabiya, which is a love song. It's about a guy who's got a crush on a girl, and the setting is largely in Andalusia in Spain. And the reason why she sang this song is because it gave this beautiful vision of in Sevilla and in Andalusia in Spain, Christians, Jews, and Muslims used to live together peacefully. And so it's a love song, and the love song, the lyrics are vague enough to where the guy it's a woman singing, but she's speaking for the guy in the song who longs for his love, and with the almond-shaped eyes. And those almond-shaped eyes could belong to anybody. They could belong to a Jewish person, a Palestinian person. They could belong to a Christian. And she leaves it intentionally vague. And this is Fairuz's way of saying, enough of this sectarianism, enough of this violence. This is a love song about people who love each other. And so I thought it's a little bit of more of a party song. If you've ever been to a party in Lebanon, I highly recommend it. It is a life-changing experience. You probably won't come home till 5 a.m. But anyway, it's a bit jaunty and a bit energetic, but if you want to know what it's like to just be in a taxi cab in Lebanon and dream of better times, this song is it.
We will cue that up. And just as we close, I'd just like everybody to stand, who's the remnant, the faithful that are here. We talked about prayer, and I don't know of any better way than to end with the Lord's Prayer. So let's, Brian referred to it, just praying for God's kingdom to come on this earth as it is in heaven. So I think the words, if you're unfamiliar, will be up on the screen, but let's pray that together now. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks for being here. You are dismissed.